It's almost like drinking the water. You know, it becomes embedded. And so you can challenge an individual policy. You can even say, look, you thought the following was going to happen and it didn't. I mean, I'll give you an example of that, by the way. So this is in the Obama chapter. In 2011, there was a Security Council resolution that was on settlements. And we had a debate in front of the president on this. And certain cabinet officials were saying, if we go ahead and we veto this settlement resolution, this is going to put the United States in the middle of the Arab Spring. Right now in all the demonstrations, there's no focus on the United States. The minute we veto settlements, we're going to be in the middle of it. Now think about it. That really was an extraordinary argument. And we were in front of the president, going around the room, and you'll have to read the book to see who was saying what. But so the first three senior people, cabinet level, are saying certain things. We don't want to be put in the middle of the Arab Spring. Suddenly, Tahrir Square, we're going to be an issue. The president turns to me and he says, "What do you think of that?" And I said, not entirely diplomatically, I said, well, this reflects a view of a different era and a lack of understanding of what's going on. I said, no one is in Tahrir Square because they're thinking about the Palestinians. I'm not saying they'll never think about the Palestinians, but this is about justice for them. This is about self-determination for them. This is about the relationship between ruler and ruled. We can veto this resolution because no one is focused on the Palestinians. That's not the issue for them. But the weight of the issue, the weight of these assumptions was so prominent that this was taken as a given until I challenged it. Now the president didn't decide in front of everybody. And in fact, we made an effort to it was Abu Mazen was pushing this resolution, we made an effort to head it off. And I was with the president when he called Abu Mazen, and Abu Mazen he actually said he had to consult with his leaders to respond to the president, and I wrote a note to the president saying, that's his way of saying no. The president understood it, hung up, and he turns to me, and he says, so when we veto this resolution, because he hasn't told anybody else yet, he says, when we veto this resolution, nothing's going to happen, is it? And I said, no, nothing's going to happen. And 2 months later, we're back in a situation, not with the president in a meeting. It's not on settlements, it's an issue that has to deal with the Israelis. And the exact same arguments are being made. And I say, once again, I say, look, we had this argument 2 months ago. Now, what is it? You all argued that if we vetoed the resolution, the sky was going to fall. And nothing happened. Now, what is it about your view of the region that was wrong? And there's dead silence. And finally, one person speaks up. I mean, there's silence for a couple of minutes. One person finally stands up and says, well, we paid a price. And I said, what was that? And he said, well, you just can't see it. To which I said suddenly, well, you got me there. So that's what I mean about assumptions, that basically they become like the air you breathe and you can't even question them. So this was an effort systematically to show in every administration how decisions were made and what the reality actually was.
Let's try and get some audience questions. Sir, please stand and...
So thank you very much, Ambassador Ross. Does oil play a role, and are these three assumptions just a way of hiding the fact that we're running scared for oil, and does the change in the oil posture in the world today give the United States and Israel both new opportunities?
It did for a long time. The question was, does oil play a role? And given the new reality of the oil market, does that create new opportunities and possibilities? And my answer was, yes, it did for a long time. I mean, you go back, I was citing Forrestal claim in '48 that if we recognize the state of Israel, it would be a disaster for us. We'd all have to be driving 4-cylinder cars within 10 years. We were going to lose our access to oil. maybe having done that, we'd actually been better off, but that's a different issue. But yes, I think for a long time, it did play a role. And obviously, the circumstances are different now, but there's something else that's different. You look at the region today, the Saudis look at the Israelis as being a bulwark against Iran. They share a perception of a common threat. And there is, even though because of the Palestinian issue, there is overt cooperation, there is cooperation that the Israelis have with most of the Arab states. I have a colleague who refers to the Israelis as being the first Jewish Sunni state. I don't think it's just, yes, we have a new reality in terms of oil, but I already think that as a dimension of the policy is maybe less important than it has been in the past, but historically, absolutely, it was a prime consideration. Especially after the oil embargo in '73. For Carter, everything Carter did was driven by a fear there was going to be another oil embargo without recognizing the Saudis realized after they'd done it that on the one hand they got a bonanza, and then when they triggered this global recession, they paid a price for it. Number one, and then number two, they realized they wanted to buy arms from us. And if they maintained an oil embargo, they couldn't buy arms from us. So there wasn't, and I go through and I point this out, there was a lack of understanding of what the dynamic was even then.
Let's take a question. Ariel Cohen, who himself is a distinguished Russian expert and a Middle East expert.
Ambassador Ross, a terrific presentation. Thank you very much. I think the main lesson for us is that we don't learn from history, and I think you're articulating it very well. I was looking for an end to play devil's advocate. And what I want to ask is long-term demographic change. You said it's doomed to succeed. But if you're looking down the road, if you're looking at the student body that is emerging on our campuses, these guys are going to be in your position in 20 years. They'll be in the State Department. They're going to be in the intelligence community. They're going to be in the White House. So the radical anti-Israel student body, on the one hand, and the growing Muslim population of this country, which is not exactly the Zionist Federation. How do you address that? What should be the strategy that we should be thinking about in order for that not to happen? Thank you.
First, I think it's a very fair question. At the end of the book, I talk about 4 alarm bells. One alarm bell is that we will be a minority-majority country in 25 to 30 years, meaning Asian Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans will constitute the majority. They don't have a history of a connection to Israel. So that's an alarm bell, and it's an argument for the Jewish community to be reaching out to them. Certainly with minorities, look at the history of the Jewish community in relationship to minorities and the role we played in the civil rights movement. We should be building a common language right now.
Can I tell you one thing, Ambassador?
Sure.
One of the things is that when we have gone out, we're very involved in the BDS fight, is we found out that using the language, is that trying to express to young African American leaders today on campus that the Jewish community was there in the civil rights movement is ancient history for them.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying that was around. I'm not saying go and make that argument. I'm saying, you know what? Relate to them and say, you know what? Black Lives Matter. Relate to them on the issues. If you look, for example, at where the Jewish community is the majority of the Jewish community. Look, when you use the Jewish community, you can't say everybody agrees, but a majority of the Jewish community on the issues that matter to them, there is a kind of sympathy. So you should be reaching out. On the BDS movement on campus, what are they trying to do? They're basically trying to say, we're oppressed, you're oppressed, let's have a common bond against the oppressors. And we basically have to debunk that. We have to make it clear that's not the case. So one alarm bell is just the future of where we're headed and the implication that it has for reaching out to those communities. A second alarm bell is Israel has done well being an American issue, not a Republican or Democratic issue. Particularly because we're going to become a majority country. This is not the time for Israel to lose its nonpartisan character. And there needs to be a serious effort to ensure that is sustained. A third element, especially important as you relate to those communities. Israel is the only democracy in the area. I mean, it's not even a close call. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. But you see efforts within Israel by some on the right to challenge the independence of the Supreme Court. Now you have an NGO law that's being written that is certainly seen in Europe and places here as being an illiberal move. Interestingly enough, Michael Oren came out, even though he's part of the coalition, came out against that legislation, which, given the fact that this is a government that has a majority of one, when one person defects, that can obviously affect whether you get it. But having Israel being mindful of how it continues to project a democratic image is very important. Lastly, I think it's very important for Israel to be able to take initiatives that show when it says it's for two states for two peoples, its settlement policy reflects that. There shouldn't be a question of Israel's settlement policy. Look at BDS today. BDS, there is an international consensus that favors two states. And nobody knows that BDS is against two states. BDS is about Israel not existing. It is against two states. But they keep the focus on occupation and settlements. If Israel's policy, the Prime Minister of Israel says his policy is two states for two peoples. If the settlement policy of the Israeli government was, we won't build what we think is a Palestinian state, we won't build to the east of the security barrier, we won't build the 92% of the West Bank, that immediately debunks the argument that Israel is against two states, and it puts the focus on the Palestinians. Well, what are you doing to support two states? And the BDS movement, okay, Israel is making it clear it's in favor of two states. What's your position? You want to expose BDS, you want to challenge BDS, you want to delegitimize BDS, instead of having the delegitimizers dominate the kind of political discourse, we need to delegitimize the delegitimizers. So those four things I sort of outlined in the concluding of the book, and I think it's one way to get at the concerns you raised.
Thank you. Actually, when we recently had a battle just the other day in the Virginia House of Delegates, and we won an 89-2 support for our resolution that condemned the BDS movement. And one of the most effective arguments, exactly what you said, Ambassador, is that when we switched the tables and said, this is not, they're painting their struggle on the aegis of human rights. We're saying this is really just another calculated, quiet, liberal-sounding way of destroying the state of Israel. And when we put it to them, that is when it resonates. So we've seen that 100% in the grassroots.
All you got to do is look at the principles of BDS says.
It does say one state.
Right.
We're going to take one more here, and then we're going to move to the audience. I promise this gentleman.
Again, we appreciate.
We'll get you in a second. Oh, go.
You already said.
Good.
Yes, earlier you said.
For those of you who remember Phil Donahue.
Earlier you said that the relationship between Israel and the United States is based on both values and interests. Which would you assess primacy to? Which is more important?
You know, it's interesting. In the 1980s, when I was in the Reagan administration, I was pushing the issue of interest. Because I was contending with those who were always saying, we have no interest in Israel. It's only values. So I wanted to contend with them and say, no, we actually have interest. Israel is like the equivalent of an additional aircraft carrier for us. Israel we can count on in the region against those who threaten our interests. And of course that's true today too. But I think in terms of this country and the demographic changes in this country, the most important thing is values. Because fundamentally that's what binds us. We have that in common with Israel. We have that in common with nobody else in the region. There may be countries in the region where we can share interests, but there's no other countries in the region where we share values. And for me, I think ultimately what sustains this relationship is we are two like-minded democracies.
One more from this section. Sir?
Thank you very much for your remarks tonight. I was wondering, in your experience, when you run into different administrations being, let's say, somewhat opposed to Israel, how much of that is a result of anti-Semitism rather than where the interests of the United States are?
Yeah. For a long time, I would say it was anti-Semitism. I think the turning point is probably also again in the Reagan administration, mostly because of George Shultz. George Shultz mandated something for the first time, where in the Near East Affairs Bureau of the State Department, until that time, if you worked on the Israeli desk or you worked in Israel, typically your other career posts were to South Africa or Taiwan. Literally, the way the State Department approached Israel was to treat it as if it was one of the pariah states. And Shultz changed that. Shultz said if you're going to rise up in the Near East Affairs Bureau, you have to serve in Israel. Either serve in Israel or serve on the Israeli desk. You cannot be in the Near East Affairs Bureau without having had some responsibility for working on Israel. That was a very big change, I would say, even sociologically in the State Department. Prior to that time, and you'll see it when you go through the book, some of the things that are said can only be seen as anti-Semitic. There's an intelligence assessment that I cite in the Kennedy administration on the Israeli nuclear weapons program. It's a CIA assessment, obviously declassified. And it's astounding the way it's written. Literally, it talks about the Jewish scientists who are helping the Israelis. The Jewish scientists, what would you expect? What else would you expect? Who are doing this with the implication being they're helping the Israelis against our interests. And it's the amazing thing about it, shows you how embedded the psychology was. This was a formal written document, meaning it was reviewed. It wasn't just an in-house draft. It was something that was circulated throughout the whole government. And it was written that way without a second thought. So, you know, and I tell a story in the Carter administration. When the first administration I was in was in the Carter administration. And I tell a story, you'll read the whole part of it, but the Israelis had made a request in 1977, which is 3.5 years after the Yom Kippur War. They made a request for a 10-year proposal for arms deliveries. And I'm the youngest person in the room, my first job. We're in something called the tank. They still have it, the tank in the Pentagon where the JCRC is a secure facility. So you know, there are people from the White House who are there, other representatives from different parts of the Pentagon, State Department, intelligence communities, and they're going around the room and they're saying the Israelis don't need, the Israelis can defeat any combination of Arabs, therefore they don't need these weapons. And this mantra is being repeated one by one by one by one. Finally, I raised my hand and I said, well, isn't that the wrong measurement? I said, you know, shouldn't we, first of all, evaluate, does this, if we provide this package to the Israelis, does it make war less likely because it enhances Israeli deterrence? That should be in our interest, one. Two, does it, if there's a war, one of the things we saw last time is the longer the war went on, the more we had to supply the Israelis. You're all concerned about the impact on the Arabs. If we give the Israelis enough that A, war termination can come more quickly, we wouldn't even have to resupply it during a war. So shouldn't we evaluate, does it help in terms of war termination? And last I said, you know, in '73, we had a superpower confrontation. The risk of escalation is great, which is another reason why you want to end the war as quickly as you can. Should we evaluate this again in terms of rapid war termination, avoiding escalation and superpower confrontation? There's dead silence in the room. Now, in my first draft, and I changed it, you'll see, I changed it in the book. In my first draft, how many people here have seen the movie Annie Hall? Do you remember when he meets her family? Now they look at it. With the feds? In my first draft, that's the way I wrote it. That's the way I was being looked at. The actual, the final version of the book, I wrote to say, the look was, we didn't know he was Jewish.
So let me piggyback. How has being a Jewish, prominent Jewish government policy peacemaker impacted your ability or helped or hindered your job in any way?
Well, I think when I was our negotiator, you know, the Arabs used to love to blame me for everything. You know, but part of it was when they were doing something that they really didn't want to do, or they felt exposed them in front of their public, they had to blame somebody. And if you blame the president, well, the president walks away and says, not doing it, not working with you anymore. You blame the Secretary of State, same thing. You blame the envoy, that's what you do with the envoy, right? The fact that I was Jewish gave them their handle. And so, what would you expect? I got a lot of that. But it really didn't affect the way I did business. You know, I represented the President of the United States, and that's how I was operating. And first of all, everybody who dealt with me knew that I was straight the way I dealt. They may not like it when I would tell them they needed to do certain things. But, you know, it wasn't because I was Jewish, it was because this is what it took to try to succeed. There was one time, I will tell you, the easiest meeting I ever had with our